We turn to 1 Samuel. Last week, remember, we looked at the beginning of King Saul's appointment as king, chapter 12 with Simeon. Today we're looking at the end, unfortunately. Bit of a shocker, really. He really didn't accept God as the one in control. He wanted to be his own man. Remember, he was a bit of a playboy last week, and his father just sent him off on what we call a wild goose chase today, but really a wild donkey chase. Yeah, he sent him all around the place just to get rid of him out of the way. But he ended up being the same person, didn't he, even as a king. Saul was a bit of a disaster, but God allowed the people of Israel to experience King Saul. And what would happen if you had a person in charge who wasn't following and being obedient to what God had commanded? Well, today we're looking at chapter 15 of 1 Samuel. We look at the first 26 verses. Samuel said to Saul, "I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people Israel." So listen now to the message from the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says: "I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. Now go, attack the Amalekites, and totally destroy everything that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys." And so Saul summoned the men and mustered them at Kalaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 men from Judah. Saul went to the city of Amalek and set an ambush in the ravine. And then he said to the Kenites, "Go away, leave the Amalekites so that I do not destroy you along with them. For you showed kindness to all the Israelites when they came up from Egypt." So the Kenites moved away from the Amalekites. And then Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Bala to Shur to the east of Egypt. And he took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive. And all his people he totally destroyed with the sword. But Saul and the army spared Agag and the best of the sheep and cattle, fat calves and lambs, everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely. But everything that was despised and weak, they totally destroyed. And then the word of the Lord came to Samuel: "I am grieved that I have made Saul king, because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions." Samuel was troubled, and he cried out to the Lord all that night. Early in the morning, Samuel got up and went to meet Saul, but he was told, "Saul has gone to Carmel. There he has set up a monument in his own honor and has turned and gone on down to Gilgal." And when Samuel reached him, Saul said, "The Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions." But Samuel said, "What then is this bleating of sheep in my ears? What is that lowing of cattle that I hear?" And Saul answered, "Well, the soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep and the cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but we totally destroyed the rest." "Stop," said Samuel to Saul. "Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night." "Tell me," Saul replied. Samuel said, "Although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and he sent you on a mission, saying, 'Go and completely destroy those wicked people, the Amalekites. Make war on them until you have wiped them out.' Why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eyes of the Lord?" "But I did obey the Lord," Saul said. "I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back Agag, their king. The soldiers took sheep and cattle from the plunder, the best of what was devoted to God, in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God at Gilgal." But Samuel replied, "Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as obeying the voice of the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king." And then Saul said to Samuel, "I have sinned. I violated the Lord's command and your instructions. I was afraid of the people, and so I gave in to them. Now I beg you, forgive my sin and come back with me, so that I may worship the Lord. But Samuel said to him, I will not go back with you. You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel. As Samuel turned to leave, Saul caught hold of the hem of his robe, and it tore. And Samuel said to him, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today, and has given it to one of your neighbors, to one better than you. He who is the glory of Israel does not lie or change his mind, for he is not a man that he should change his mind. And Saul replied, I have sinned, but please honor me before the elders of my people and before Israel. Come back with me, so that I may worship the Lord your God. And so Samuel went back with Saul and worshipped the Lord. And then Samuel said, bring me Agag, king of the Amalekites. And Agag came to him confidently, thinking, surely the bitterness of death is past. But Samuel said, as your sword has made woman childless, so your mother will be childless among women. And Samuel put Agag to death before the Lord at Gilgal. And then Samuel left for Ramah, but Saul went up to his home in Gibeah of Saul. Until the day Samuel died, he did not go to see Saul again, though Samuel mourned for him, and the Lord was grieved that he had made Saul king over Israel. In chapter 15, we have the final rejection of Saul as king because of his disobedience to God's command and not fully destroying the Amalekites and their property. By his wars and victories, Saul hoped to exalt his own name and honour, but by his own mismanagement and disobedience, he ruined himself, and his honour lay in the dust. Saul continued to walk in foolishness throughout his whole life as king, doing what he thought was right, regardless of God's will. We look at three aspects today, and the first one is the commission that God gave Saul to completely destroy the Amalekites. The second one is that Saul's examination before Samuel and his sentencing. And then the third last one, Samuel's final farewell to Saul. Let's first of all look at the commission that God gave Saul to completely destroy the Amalekites. Samuel reminds Saul of what God has done for him. He says at the beginning of the chapter, I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people Israel. So listen now to the message of the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says, I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them when they came out from Egypt. Now go, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare. God has set the terms for Saul to be king, and these included him being obedient. See that back last week in chapter 12, verses 14 and 15. And so God is recognizing that Saul has broken these conditions, and judgment is about to happen. And God's grieving here echoes Genesis chapter 6, verse 6, regarding the creation of humanity before the judgment of the flood. We read in verse 6, the Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled or grieved. Samuel tells Saul, whatever God commanded him to do, he was bound to do it. Now therefore listen to the voice of the Lord. Note that while God shows us mercy through his goodness and grace, there are strong obligations upon us to be obedient to him. And we read this response from a psalmist in Psalm 116, verse 12. How can I repay the Lord for all his goodness to me? And the answer is to be obedient to the Lord's command. Saul is now appointed to do God's will in the destruction of the Amalekites. He is not to spare them out of pity or covet their possessions. And when Saul came to attack the Amalekites, in which he was sure of victory, because it was an order by God, he had thousands. Remember, there was 210,000 at his call. Remember Remember, he went off the war before out of his own way, and he only took 600 in the end to fight the war, and yet he lost. He was injured, hurt through his own disobedience to God. But here, God has blessed them with 210 soldiers. He went on to warn the Kenites to separate themselves from the Amalekites. And now, if you knew a little bit of Old Testament history, you'd realize that the Kenites were relations of Jethro, and Jethro was Moses' father-in-law. And they were people that were tent dwellers, so it was easy for them to move on to other lands or empty land away from living within the city of the Amalekites. And God is not unrighteous to forget the kindness shown to his people. Remember, it was written in the Bible, I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. God's remembering the kindness of the Kenites' ancestors in favour to them at the same time when he is punishing the injuries done by the ancestors of the Amalekites. When destroying judgments are made by God, he gives opportunity to separate the sheep from the goats. It is dangerous being found in the company of God's enemies, and it's our duty to come out from among them when we are called. Revelations 18:4 says, I heard another voice from heaven say, come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues, for her sins are piled up to the heaven, and God has remembered her crimes. And yet, Saul spared Agag, maybe because he was a king like himself, and perhaps in hope of he was getting a great ransom for her. And he spared the best of the cattle and destroyed only what was good for nothing. That which was destroyed was in effect sacrificed to the justice of God. And Saul to think that the despised and the sick and the lame and the lean was good enough for God, while he reserved the best for himself, the best animals. Did Saul think that he was better than God and deserving more honour? The second point we have today is Saul's examination before Samuel and his sentence. In verse 12, early in the morning, Samuel got up and went to meet Saul, but he was told Saul had gone to Carmel. There he had set up a monument in his own honour and has turned and gone down to Gilgal. Setting up such monuments was common amongst the ancient kings, and Saul certainly seems set on exalting himself for the victory. For Saul had gone to Gilgal, in verse 12, the place where he had been made king, if we read back in chapter 11, verse 15. And he had been totally obedient to God's command. His kingship would have been conferred here at Gilgal. But Samuel was informed that Saul had set up a triumphant monument in his own honour at Carmel. And in the city in the mountains of Judah, he was seeking his own honour more than the honour of God. And then he marched on down to Gilgal in a victory parade. If Samuel and God are unhappy, Saul is pretty happy with himself. And he seems to really think that he's obeyed God, even though he hasn't. Isn't he self-deceived? Samuel points out the obvious. In verse 14, Samuel says, what then is this bleating of sheep in my ears? There was to be no livestock left, no plunder. And all Samuel had to do was listen. And he knew that Saul didn't listen to God. Saul then reflects and he rationalizes. He said, well, the soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the animals to be a sacrifice to the Lord your God. But we totally destroyed the rest. His reflection is saying that the people did it, not him. It's the soldiers' fault if there's any fault going. And then he rationalizes that these are for sacrifice, which is a good thing, right? Even though God told them to destroy all and to take no plunder. And note, even if they were going to be sacrificed, Saul and his men would have got some of the food. Samuel said to Saul, stop deflecting. You are in charge of the people. You were given the mission. You are responsible. Stop rationalizing. You pounced on the spoil. You did what was evil in God's sight. You know, when in a similar context, Achan took spoil from Jericho, he was killed for it. Samuel goes on to insist that he's obedient, even while undermining his own defense. Agag was spared, probably as a trophy of war, which is another evidence, along with the monument, of Saul's great pride. And then Samuel destroys Saul's pretense with what has become one of the most well-known Old Testament passages, as we read in verse 22 and 23. Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice. Sacrifice is good, but obedience is better. And besides, what good is sacrifice if it comes from a disobedient heart? God's not interested in mere outward ritual, but with a heart of love for him that is expressed obedience. Saul has rebelled. He refused to do what God said. He did what he thought was right instead of God's will, which is a rejection of God. And because of this, he's judged and he is no longer under God's blessing. And in response, in verse 24, Saul says to Samuel, I have sinned, etc., because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. He went from insisting, well, I've obeyed, to I have not obeyed. And he eventually confesses why. He feared the people. The conditions of his kingship was that he would fear God and obey his voice. Here, he feared the people and obeyed their voice. And Saul asked for forgiveness, but is it sincere? Saul wants Samuel to come with him for his own reasons, to protect and project to the people that everything is okay, which is why Samuel refuses. His repentance isn't right, because he's using it to get what he wants, protection of his status. And as Samuel turns to go away, Saul seizes the hem of his robe and it tore. Now, to grab the hem of someone's robe is to take up the position of a supplicant. But when you're grabbing it, are you really want to be supplicating? It tore. He grabbed it with such force. He wants Samuel to change his mind. But this accidental tearing becomes a metaphor of God's judgment. The kingdom has been torn from him and given on to another, and that other is David. God grieves making Saul king in verses 11 and 35, but here in verse 29, does God regret and change his mind? No, as we saw in verse 11, it is that he is sorrowful because Saul broke the condition of his kingship. Here Samuel says, as opposed to Saul, God will not change his mind about choosing David and his line. We see in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 15, talking about King David, and it says, but my love will never be taken away from him as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before them. The third point we have today is Samuel's final farewell to Saul. In verse 32, Samuel says, bringing Agag, king of the Amalekites, and Agag came to him in chains, and he thought, well, surely the bitterness of death is past. But Samuel said, as your sword has made woman childless, may your mother be childless among women. And then Samuel puts Agag to death before the Lord at Gilgal. And Samuel finishes what Saul left incomplete. In verse 34, Samuel left for Ramah, but Saul went up to his home in Gibeah of Saul. And until the day Samuel died, he did not go to see Saul again. This represents a bleak and a full break of their relationship. Samuel no longer recognizes him as the rightful king. And notice throughout this chapter, Saul's use of your God, verses 15, 21, and 30, which is his own recognition of his alienation from God. And then our story ends as it began, but Samuel grieved over Saul. and the Lord regretted that he made Saul king over Israel. In Hebrews 5, we read, every high priest is selected from among the people and is appointed to represent the people in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. And this is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins, as well as the sins of the people. And no one takes this honor on himself, for he receives it when called by God. Samuel, that was his job. And he's hoping for the best of his people and the king, and that they will be obedient to God. He also knew the past history of Israel not always being obedient and resulting judgments, and has warned them also about choosing a king. And despite this, he knew his calling was to be faithfully obedient to God's commands and not to the voice of the people. And so what lessons do we learn from this? First, that Saul shows us how not to respond when we sin. Even when caught in the act, he blamed others. He rationalized his own wrong choices. He made excuses and he lied. Even when he confessed, it was to get what he wanted from Samuel. And this is a portrait of our own state of humanity. And we do these very things ourselves when we are caught in our sin. The right way to respond to sin is displayed by David, Saul's replacement. And when Nathan the prophet confronted David about his sin, David simply said, I have sinned against the Lord. 2 Samuel 12:15. He confesses with no strings attached, and then he accepts the consequences. The second lesson we have today, that God's patience has an end, and then comes judgment. God was very patient with Saul, and he told Saul, do what I tell you, and your kingdom will be established forever over Israel. But Saul chose to disobey God's specific commands over and over again, and then finally the judgment came. Paul tells us in Romans chapter 2 verse 4 that God's patience and kindness is meant to lead us to repentance. But if we don't repent, eventually we will be judged. The third lesson we have today is God demands our full obedience. Saul, he gave partial obedience, but partial obedience is no different from disobedience. We don't get to pick and choose what parts of God's will that we will put into practice. Any outward expression of religion will not make up for your disobedience. Going to church, saying you're a Christian, feigning respect for God, wearing a cross, putting on a so-called Christian t-shirt, that won't make you a Christian. What delights God's heart is a heart set on loving him, expressed in obedience to his word. The questions we should be asking, do we keep to the word of the Lord? Do we obey the voice of the Lord?